Good, good morning, everyone. I think we're gonna get started. I know it's we're getting to the end of this long 2 week for some of us that have been here now since the 28th or the 29th. Welcome to this morning panel. Thank you for joining us. We are delighted to have you with us for this panel that touches on Indigenous peoples, stewardship of lands, territories, and seascapes. We're very fortunate to have an amazing group of people who's going to be sharing with us their knowledge and experience, both from coastal and seascapes, as well as land and territories. I'd like to just start by saying, maybe just quickly introducing myself. I'm Lourdes Singa, Executive Director of International Funders for Indigenous Peoples. We are the only global philanthropy network dedicated to Indigenous peoples worldwide. Our role is to mobilize resources, advocate for Indigenous peoples' rights, and work with philanthropy to advocate for greater resources as well as direct access of philanthropic funding to Indigenous peoples' organizations. I want to take a moment to introduce our panel. And we will also invite them each after I do introductions to share a little bit about their work. So we have today with us, we'll hear from Barry Hunter, who is with the North Australian Indigenous Land and Sea Management Alliance, known as NAISMA from Australia. We have Pamela Mayorga Caro, who is with the Indigenous Peoples Marine Coastal Spaces, or known as ENPO, from Chile. She will be speaking in Spanish. And we have Balquiso Buba from the Network of Indigenous and Local Populations for the Sustainable Management of Forest Ecosystems in Central Africa, or known as REPALIAC. And last but not least, we have Ariel the Ranger, Executive Director of Indigenous Climate Action, or ICA, in Canada. With that, I'd like to get us started, and I'm going to ask each of you if you could take about 3 minutes each to please share about your work, the work that you're doing, and the challenges you're facing in your communities or communities in relation to the work that you're doing as it relates to land, territories, and seascapes. And Barry, I think we understand you're going to show a slide. If we could have his slides come up, please. Yeah, I think it's up. There. Maybe you want to say next?
Yeah. Thanks, everyone. So, yeah, my name is Barry Hunter. I'm the acting CEO of the Northern Australian Indigenous Land and Sea Management Alliance. We're an alliance of Aboriginal land councils across Northern Australia. We cover a big area, and we work in and around predominantly Indigenous land and sea management, which includes a whole range of things, such as obviously land and sea management, but biodiversity, weeds and ferals, and there's a fair bit of work in and around carbon within carbon industries, but also looking at projects around biodiversity offsets. And we work within regional spaces to assist regional groups, but also direct funding into Indigenous organisations on the ground that actively managing areas, large tracts of land. There's predominantly across Northern Australia is Indigenous held lands. The slide is not working. keep going. Yep. Keep going until you see a map. And within that, there's a whole variety of different works that we do, but also challenges and issues that we face, predominantly looking at how we support the activity of rangers on the ground in undertaking their work that they do. And rangers across Australia are funded by the Australian government. There's 2,000 funded full-time positions, and we try and actively work with support those across Northern Australia. But we have another thing that is called Indigenous Protected Areas. And these Indigenous Protected Areas are also large tracts of land that we try and support and work with groups on the ground to actively manage their country. I'll give you a good indication of the work that needs to be done. So for protected area estates, so any of the big national parks in Australia, the average amount of funding that goes into it is $15 per hectare. For Indigenous protected areas per hectare, it sits around $1.87. So it's grossly underfunded in regards to the type of activities and outcomes that we try and achieve. But that's predominantly the work that we do. And we're also looking at new and emerging economies, so carbon, ecosystem services and biodiversity outcomes. Thank you.
Mari Monku Taimu, Inche Pamela Mayorga Piñán. Mi nombre es Pamela Mayorga, soy de Chile, de la Patagonia chilena. Dentro de los trabajos que estamos realizando en Chile, nosotros partimos netamente por una gran problemática que la ley de pesca en Chile, esto enfocarnos más en el contexto del mar, maritorio, en Chile hay una ley de pesca que no consideró a los pueblos originarios y menos a las mujeres. Por lo mismo, por un movimiento político-territorial desde los pueblos originarios y pesqueros, se levantó una nueva ley. Esta ley es la 20.249, que es la ley Lafkenche, que nace de una identidad de un pueblo originario y que incorpora a todos los pueblos. Y al no incorporarnos en esta ley, permitió que la industria ingresara al mar, concesionara y no dejara acceso a los pueblos originarios al mar, instalándose también en sitios de significación cultural. Por lo mismo, esta ley permite el reconocimiento legal de estos usos constitucionarios, la que se movilizaron los pueblos. Entonces, a partir de esta ley se solicitan áreas marinas. Del lugar de donde yo vengo son 246.000 hectáreas, pero aún así se han ido planificando y se han ido levantando en diversos maritorios estas áreas indígenas, en donde cada área pide una administración de ella y también una gestión de ella. Esta ley ha sido tan importante que ha significado que podamos sentarnos a la misma mesa con gente que planifica el territorio. ¿Por qué? Porque es un manto inicial de protección para los territorios. Al solicitar este espacio en Chile, hace que paralice la industria para que no siga avanzando y puedan protegerse los sitios de significación cultural. Lo importante de esta ley, que es muy poderosa en Chile, muy poderosa, pero Chile no ha podido aplicarla o se ha rehusado en poder gestionarla y aplicarla bien, aplicándole burocracia para que estos procesos no avancen. Pero sí, es muy importante. ¿Por qué? Porque integra a todos, integra a pueblos originarios, a gente de la pesca, a comunidades costeras y rurales, con una visión, con una cosmovisión, con una forma holística, una forma multiescalar de planificar el territorio donde todos conversan. Es una excelente ley, es un proceso que se está llevando en Chile desde los pueblos originarios, pero los grandes desafíos han sido eso, que Chile se ha rehusado en aplicarla, ha costado un poco en ese sentido por la gran burocracia, pero sí nosotros como pueblos hemos generado grandes alianzas entre distintos pueblos, cahuéscar, yaganes, mapuches, para que esta ley tenga más fuerza cada día, porque es una ley que, como dije, reivindica a los pueblos, vela por la cosmovisión y una forma holística de derecho territorial de los pueblos. Más que nada eso.
Eklanete dene sotlaneta Ariel Tseekwe Hushe, Duranje Betsieni Hesli. My name is Ariel Tseekwe Duranje, and I'm a member of the Athabasca Chipewyan First Nation, also known as the Kaitale dene Sotlane, which is located in the Treaty 8 territories of northern Alberta. I think that this is a really, really important conversation. Not just the conversation of the role of Indigenous peoples in stewarding our lands, territories, and seascapes, but of the disparities in funding and access to resources and access to places where decision-making is happening regarding our lands and territories. In particular, I think that there's a lot of lessons to be learned from what has happened in my territories and my region. In my territories, we have seen the development of the largest industrial oil and gas project in the world, which is the Alberta tar sands, or oil sands. This project encompasses a landmass that is bigger than the Wales and England combined. And we've seen massive amounts of destruction, contamination, and degradation to critical ecosystems that are directly next to a UNESCO World Heritage Site where my community lives. This World Heritage Site is known as the Wood Buffalo National Park and is the last remaining inland freshwater, is the largest inland freshwater delta in the world. And yet, we have a colonial country that feels that it's okay to continue to expand oil and gas projects, mega hydro projects, uranium mining projects, and diamond mining projects surrounding this UNESCO World Heritage Site, which all exist within or adjacent to Indigenous communities. Our communities have been challenging the expansion of all of these industries for the last 60 years with little to no progress. And this has amounted to the degradation to our capacities to continue our lifeways. This looks like a major decrease in the one of the keystone species, which are caribou, woodland caribou, which we've seen in the last 20 years decline over 80%. I think actually this year it's at a 90% decline. We've seen a decline in bison. One of the last genetically unique herds in our region has almost completely disappeared. I believe that there are 60 of these bison left. And this is a major, major crisis in the region. We are seeing the disappearance and the threatening and the endangerment and the extinction of many keystone species in our territories because of the mismanagement by colonial powers of our lands and territories. My community tried to advance what we called a treaty rights land use management plan, utilizing the treaty rights that we have attained as our communities, signatories to Treaty 8, to demand that we have control over our lands and territories and ecosystems. However, all we've been able to do is contribute or comment, rather, on existing proposed land management and land use plans regarding our river systems, our forests, and biodiversity and conservation of keystone species. It has been incredibly difficult because even today, in 2023, when we know that we need to be phasing out of fossil fuels, when we know that we cannot afford to continue to expand, we are seeing projects continue to be approved. Projects that won't even begin to go online until 2026 and that have a 60 to 80-year life cycle. This is not just climate suicide, this is environmental and cultural genocide to the peoples in our communities. But we're not just sitting here standing idly by. We are fighting to intervene in the regulatory review processes. We are demanding the development of Indigenous protected and conservation areas, but like my brother from Australia, we're running into poorly resourced or underfunded projects. And the dangers and risks that this poses to our communities is really huge, because when we have an underfunded Indigenous and protected and conservation area in our region, the first people that come to offer resources to help fund that are the very corporations that are involved in violating our rights. That was very loud. For those online, there was a loud scream. So what this looks like is, in our region, there's really big operators like Shell, Suncor, all these operators, and these operators are coming in to the rescue and offering our communities ways to increase the lack of funding that the government is not giving us to conserve our area. What that then results in is then these corporations utilizing our indigenous protected and conservation areas as conservation offsets to the projects that they're operating literally 20, 30 kilometers away. This feels like so much hypocrisy and the failures of our government to uphold the rights of our communities, not just in Canada, but the world over. And the lessons to be learned through these types of conversations are, we have to understand Canada has one of the richest and darkest histories in developing systems of oppression. In fact, the Indian Act, which governs Indigenous peoples in Canada and puts us in a paternalistic relationship as wards of the state, was used to model apartheid in South Africa, was used to model the systems and structures to manage the Aborigines in Australia. It has been used to find ways to manipulate communities in South America in finding ways that they can access those resources through continued oppression of Indigenous people's rights, through manipulation of the regulatory systems that allows them to continue to approve projects that violate our capacities to intervene, to steward our lands and territories, and manage our seascapes. We have seen this time and time again, where just a few years ago, the Australian government came to Canada to do a tour to figure out how they can work in partnership with Indigenous peoples for resource management during their expansion of concessions in the Northern Territory for fracking. All of this is for one goal: to continue to expand colonial power and rule and degrade Indigenous peoples' rights and sovereignty over our continued relationships for stewarding our lands, territories, and seascapes. In my community, we have fought hard. We have continued to fight not just for our lands and territories, but for our kin, the caribou and the bison and the migratory birds, which we are seeing declining every single year. We are fighting for our waterways, the Athabasca River, the mighty Athabasca River, which feeds all the way into the Arctic Ocean. I should mention my communities in the Arctic. And this river system is critical not just for our community's livelihood, but for the livelihoods of thousands and thousands of communities along the corridor of the Athabasca Peace Delta. And so we need to not just be talking about upholding Indigenous people's rights. We need to be talking about directly funding so that we don't see this marginalization continue.
Thank you very much for giving me the floor. Good morning, everyone. For us in Cameroon and in the Central African region, the stories are also similar. We have been doing some work when it comes to protecting and defending our land rights, because we realize that people used to say Indigenous people, they don't have use for land. So that's why we have decided to work on projects that deal with land use, to use our land differently, not only carrying out pastoral activities or carrying out hunting and gathering. Because one of the things that happen in Cameroon, for example, when they want to kind of relocate somebody from the land, they say you should prove that you were using this land before you can be compensated and so on. So now we teach them to use the land by maybe planting trees, so that because when the trees are there, they know that, okay, this is evidence of land use. Somewhere these people have been using this land. We also plant, like, improve species of pastures on the land so that we don't leave the land empty, because when they see the land empty, that is when they think that they can come and colonize the land. So we try to make the women, especially, to domesticate some traditional medicinal plants, because we realize that with the advent of climate change and biodiversity loss, we have some species of plants that are already disappearing. So we make the women to use some of the empty spaces of the land to plant some of these plants so that they can use it, and they can also use these plants to teach their children And this can also serve as a research center on indigenous and traditional knowledge. We also do advocacy on the land reform process and land rights for indigenous people, because in Cameroon the land rights of indigenous people are not recognized or respected. So we try to work with the government when they started the land reform process in 2011. We produce a note of position for indigenous people through the Bororo Social and Cultural Development Association, that is the Boskuda, that was piloting the National Engagement Strategy Plan on Land Governance in Cameroon. So we put also the position of indigenous people, because we wanted the land rights of the customary and community land rights as well as forest rights to be recognized. So we are waiting for the new land law to come out, and we see what it gives. We also work on access to justice when it comes to land rights violations, because indigenous communities, they have land rights violations that they suffer from. So we work with other organizations, like the network of organizations of Cameroon Organizations of Human Rights, where we identify cases of land rights violation, and then we bring it to the knowledge of the human rights organizations, so that the people can follow up and have access to justice. The difficulties we still face in this, we still have issues of land grabbing, which have continued, and this land grabbing has led to forced relocations, and people have to move when they don't even need to move, they are forced to move. We have issues of peace and security now in the Northwest and Southwest regions. People are no longer safe. The indigenous people are kind of targeted, especially the Bororo pastoralist community, so they don't have a choice than to move. So most of them have moved, abandoning their cattle, abandoning their lands. They have become refugees in town. They are now like internally displaced. The land rights, as I earlier said, customary and community land rights are not recognized, so women don't even have access and control over land, and they are the highest people who use the land. So we have harassment of some of our land right defenders, where people are being harassed and so on, taken up and down, so it is also another big problem. We have issues of recognition when it comes to our chieftaincy, traditional leadership, because the mainstream communities, they kind of have the first degree traditional leadership, whereas indigenous communities, they have very few first degree leadership. They have some third class chiefs and so on, and the mainstream society chiefs, they can just come to the indigenous community and decide to sell lands in indigenous communities. We have insufficient political representation where decisions are being made. We don't have so many indigenous people. For example, like in the parliament in Cameroon, we have 180 parliamentarians, and since the creation of that parliament till today, there have never been an indigenous person in that parliament. In the Senate, is the same story. We have 130 senators. The indigenous people, we have 2 alternate senators. And the alternate senators, they don't go for decision making, so there is practically no one to take decisions when it comes to decision making. So in terms of like the ministers in Cameroon, we have more than 40 ministers. We don't have an indigenous minister. Secretary Generals, we have only one Secretary General who is in the Ministry of Livestock. So in terms of decision making, where the real decisions are being made, we don't have people there. So for solutions, we don't also have sufficient funding to cover the national territory when we are doing works on land rights, because, like for example, the Bororo pastoralist people, they are spread all over the 10 regions of the country. The forest communities, they are in about 3 regions of the country. So all of these people having land rights violations in left, right, and so on, we don't have sufficient funding to take care of issues that concern them. So it is very important for indigenous people to have more funding so that they can be able to take care of these land right issues, and then governments should also try to recognize and respect land rights of indigenous people. Thank you.
I think what we are hearing both at this COP, but also even beyond COPs, right, and also from the panelists, is I think the critical need of respecting indigenous people's rights. In particular this COP, I've heard a lot about just transition, and I worry that we will spend time trying to, precious time that we need to actually advocate for rights or a rights-based approach to conversations, and we'll have to deviate energy to help define or ensure that how just transition is being defined is actually a rights-based framework. Yet, at the same time, while we are all kind of fighting and struggling to navigate everything that comes to indigenous territories. At the same time, indigenous peoples have been applying different ways of working and strategies to both advance self-determination and advance their rights. And I'd like to invite now Barry and Pamela to perhaps touch on how your organizations are particularly applying strategies or making advances in relation to perhaps either treaties that have to do with oceans, or Pamela, as you mentioned earlier, country laws that your communities are following or make sure are not impacting your livelihoods, your lifeways, and your self-determination. So Barry, maybe if you both touch on the seascapes and the oceans piece.
Bueno, en Chile tuvimos un proceso de querer cambiar nuestra constitución. ¿Por qué? Porque se estaban entregando y se estaban concesionando los elementos de la naturaleza, el mar, la tierra, el agua, porque no tenemos una constitución intercultural ni plurinacional. Por lo mismo, ahora Chile sigue en el proceso y no nos ha ido muy bien. Como ese cambio ha costado en el país. ¿Por qué? Porque hay mucha intervención de la industria, de políticos. Pero como comentaba anteriormente, tenemos esta ley, que es la Ley de Espacios Costeros Marinos de Pueblos Originarios, que para nosotros ha sido súper importante en la autodeterminación de los territorios, especialmente del mar, y acceso al mar, porque también, aparte de proteger porción de agua, protege porción de tierra para un acceso importante y también para cuidar los sitios arqueológicos y de significación cultural. Es un instrumento de derecho territorial principalmente porque se vela y se cuida a través de una forma colectiva los espacios colectivos. Por eso es importante. ¿Qué estrategia principalmente hemos usado? Es unirnos a la ciencia. La ciencia nos aporta los informes técnicos que nos sirven a nosotros para levantar informes y entregarle al Estado. Estos informes también se complementan con el mundo científico, pero de la arqueología, de la antropología, para levantar los sitios, un mapeo sociocultural de las áreas. Para nosotros ha sido súper importante eso, porque nosotros vamos diciendo cuáles son nuestros lugares importantes, los lugares de la medicina, los lugares sagrados. Ese mapeo cultural ha hecho que se haga una planificación multiescalar, o sea, sistémica, que no veamos, a veces el Estado ve por capas, ve el agua, un ministerio, ve otro ministerio de agricultura. En cambio, esta ley permite vernos de forma ampliada. Hemos trabajo de recuperación de la lengua, que es súper importante. Estamos haciendo mucho trabajo de ese tipo. De educación intercultural en algunos territorios, de medicina intercultural. También hemos tratado de hacer muchos hitos importantes. Hace un año varó una ballena en Chaitén, donde yo vivo. Esa ballena era una ballena azul. Esos restos se los iban a llevar a un museo. ¿Qué hicimos nosotros? Solicitamos esos restos, porque para nosotros las ballenas son muy importantes, son muy significativas para nuestros pueblos, y logramos que se quede. Son hitos, son pequeños hitos, pero esos van marcando. También con el mapeo sociocultural que hicimos, estamos recuperando nombres y la toponimia antigua, y hemos vuelto a recuperar lugares. O sea, teníamos una piedra muy importante de significación cultural, que hoy en día se llamaba Piedra de Calto, pero recuperamos su nombre antiguo y lo hemos posicionado. Los políticos también lo han posicionado. Ese mapeo cultural es muy importante, y también hemos generado redes y alianzas con las mujeres indígenas por la defensa del mar, de distintos pueblos, no solamente un pueblo, sino de todos los pueblos, y no solamente que sean indígenas, porque hay muchas personas que no son indígenas y quieren cooperar y quieren ayudar. Y estas alianzas de incidencia política son muy importantes para también visibilizar a la mujer, y el aporte y el rol que tiene la mujer. ¿Por qué? Porque la mujer ve de una forma dual, incorpora a hombre, mujer, adultos, a niños. Y eso ha sido súper importante, porque en nuestro proceso de político, territorial, que se ha levantado en el mar de Chile, ha sido muy importante el rol de la mujer. ¿Por qué? Porque el rol de la mujer Los hombres muchas veces salen a pescar, pero la mujer se queda en la casa cuidando, yendo a reuniones. De todos los roles que tiene la mujer, también se da el espacio para cuidar el mar. Y por eso ha tomado un papel muy protagónico en Chile por la defensa del mar. Y principalmente es eso, porque vela por todos, ¿no? Y tiene una voz firme y no tranza cuando hay que transar con los derechos territoriales o especialmente los derechos sociales.
In Australia, there are actually no treaties to do with Indigenous people. What we do have is the Native Title Act, which recognises Indigenous title over lands and subsistence and cultural use of it for Indigenous people of those lands. That also covers sea country as well, and we've seen some groundbreaking test cases, such as the Blue Mud Bay in Northern Territory, that recognise Indigenous use and rights over water and seascapes. Within actively, the next sort of step within that is to actively go out and use country. And there's a number of things that we've done across Northern Australia, particularly around management of keystone species, research, Indigenous-led research, and trying to really highlight where Indigenous leadership within the research space can develop outcomes for the management of country and apply those management according to customary law and culture. And those keystone species, such as turtle, marine turtle and dugong, which is a marine mammal, those types of, and indeed sharks as well, those types of activities and in management has been key to be able to get recognition of rights and interests. And I guess lastly, I just want to mention, so within the eastern coast of Australia, we've got the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park, and the reef traditional owners are very active in this space and very active in regards to their engagement and involvement in management. The reef, Great Barrier Reef, gets a lot of attention internationally, but also nationally from Australia, and a lot of funding. So this has allowed groups to argue and fight for a fair share of those management dollars, but also talk to the fact that the activity that goes on land affects what happens on the reef. You can't separate the two. So Indigenous people have been very active in that space around managing of sea country and the activities that go on land, and finding their voice in and around the type of land-based activities that occur that are detrimental to what goes on in the reef. So that's a few examples, but also Indigenous people actively involved in water in the space of just, marine and fresh water in Australia, and the rights and interests that we have within water as well.
Thank you. I think in a similar way, I'd like to invite both of you to share from the perspective on land and territories, what are some of the ways in which your organizations are moving forward strategies or pathways or advancing in supporting lifeways and self-determination of Indigenous peoples?
Yeah, I think, again, Canada as like a G7 country, having very strong recognition as a country that recognizes the rights of Indigenous peoples. We have our rights affirmed in the Constitution. We have treaty negotiations. We have very similar subsistence and cultural use recognition. And yet this hasn't really amounted to the type of protections and upholding of Indigenous rights that we have actually needed or desired. And so the work that that I do with Indigenous Climate Action focuses on really how do we begin to move towards decolonial climate policies and practices for our communities, which is not to say that we need the mechanisms that you're all fighting for. We need to be focusing on getting the constitutions and the agreements and the recognition by the colonial powers. But I think that there is a lot of work that needs to be done on the imagination of what it would be like to advance sovereignty and self-determination outside of colonial structures that exist as a way to demand more than just getting that sort of, I love the stat that you shared of $15 per hectare for national parks, and only $1.87 per hectare for indigenous protected areas. This is the type of things that we see time and time again. And if we were to demand our own sovereign decolonial structures and policies that we could uphold against these impositions by colonial states, then I feel like this is where we start to see advancement. So the work of Indigenous Climate Action is we focus on exploring what does decolonial climate policy mean? How do we move towards the structures of decolonial climate and environmental land management, and how do we begin to build those things with our communities? This is an important aspect, and it's not to diminish the work that has already been done in the country or the work that's happening in other places where we're looking to indigenize colonial land management systems and structures, but really tries to imagine that world outside of it. And this isn't new work, and ICA is not taking on new work. We are advancing and trying to amplify some of the existing incredible work for self-determination and sovereignty that has existed in so-called Canada for years. So this looks like the Haida Gwaii, which have done sovereignty and self-determination when it comes to forestry. We have seen the same thing happen with the fisheries, where communities just a couple of years ago said, we're not going to listen to the colonial laws for fisheries. We have our own rules in management, and they defied a time when they were told they could no longer harvest lobster. And they're like, actually, we're going to harvest lobster. And so our communities are not just asking for permission any longer. We are enacting our own governance and laws and recourses to demand that the government respect our traditional and hereditary systems and structures. And I think that I'm really, alarmed that we're seeing the same sort of tactics happening in Chile with this, looking at, or maybe it was, sorry, I'm trying to remember who said this now, talking about the recognition of traditional leadership. That was my sister here, where we have governments coming in and they're just looking for the right Indigenous representatives to sign off the paper. And then they say, oh, well, we consulted, or we got the permission or the consent. And this is where, when we demand our own structures and systems to be recognized in counter to colonial structures, we begin to see a shift in those power dynamics. By coming back to the direct funding question at the beginning, if we don't have resources from both the private and philanthropic sector to advance this, we're still caught up in an economic hostage situation, because colonial governments are funding Indigenous protected areas. They're funding these strategies to advance Indigenous rights and land management. And we need to see something that allows us to be able to build and imagine worlds outside of these colonial structures. And we do this at ICA through our climate leadership training, our decolonial climate policy development. And we want to begin to bridge this conversation on a larger scale so that folks outside of colonial Canada can learn from the lessons that we've learned that have set the foundations for the strategies that many colonial governments are trying to replicate in other places to continue to subjugate and oppress and remove Indigenous peoples from their lands and territories. Because let's be real, my community in G7 country, developed nation, my community was forcibly removed from our territories because of hydro development flooding. And then we were forcibly removed again because of oil and gas. And my family was removed by armed security for uranium mining. This has all happened in my lifetime. This is in my lifetime. My people have been forcibly removed and relocated for the advancements of projects that are mismanaging our lands and territories. We need to demand better. And I really, really, truly feel that's going to come through the development of sovereign land management strategies, not wrapped up in colonial systems and structures.
Thank you very much for giving me the floor once more. We'll talk about some strategies that we have been using to advance land rights for Indigenous people. what we have been doing is we have been sensitizing the indigenous people about their land rights, because most of the indigenous people, when they are being pushed around, they think that, okay, we don't have the right to land. Maybe what these people are saying is true. We just have to move. But we have been sensitizing them to know that no, you people have the rights to land. Wherever you are living, you have to be part and parcel. You live on this land. You take care of this land. This land belongs to you. For example, in the Northwest region, we had a community that has been staying on the land for more than a century, and this community was asked to move. And luckily, these people were already sensitized on their rights to land, and they decided to put up a struggle. They said, no, we will not leave. And then they had to advocate, go to the government and so on, and the people were, at the end of the day, they left them to stay on the land. So we try to also sensitize them on their rights, especially with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. We try to educate them on these national and international instruments that are governing and protecting the rights of indigenous people. Given that we are dealing with a population that has not been to school, most of them, they don't read this international legal text, and they don't even know about the existence of this international legal text. So what we do is we organize workshops where we educate them on the existing legal framework nationally and internationally, so that they can always know their rights and work for the protection of their rights. We also work with women, because women are always left behind in the indigenous communities. They suffer double discrimination. We work with them to also educate them on their rights, ensure that they have access to education, because we know that when the women are educated, they can better defend and protect their land and human rights. We also work with youths. We try to involve youths in whatever we do, because we know that the youths are the future. So we work with the youth to empower them economically. We also empower them by teaching them the various legal framework that exists, so that they can better protect and promote their rights. And we involve the youths in most of the projects that we carry out, especially in terms of land use, in terms of planting trees, exercises in local communities and so on. We involve the youths, because the youths, as they are there, they serve like the eye openers, and they can always grab the message very fast and transmit that message to their families. Thank you.
Thank you. I forget what day it was, but I think it was yesterday that I attended a panel on the Food and Agriculture Pavilion. And it was on the decade of ecosystem restoration. And I really appreciate, actually, just let me just take a moment to thank each one of you for here, because I think what we aim to do at this panel is to also bring the different ecosystems experiences. But at this panel that I attended, they came up with a report, and it was a panel of FAO and UNEP. But they have come up with a report recently where it points to global annual finance flows of 7 trillion fueling climate, biodiversity, and land degradation crisis. Whereas the funding that is actually, or the financing that is actually going to solutions, call it nature-based, call it indigenous people solutions, it doesn't compare to the 7 trillion that is actually being put into actually destruction, deforestation, and degradation, and loss of biodiversity. So it means that I think we, at IFEB, which we are working with a philanthropic ecosystem to really move more conversations, both with our members also, but with larger other philanthropic ecosystems, to bring more attention both to indigenous people's rights, but also to the solutions that indigenous peoples are bringing to the table in all of these conversations on food systems, biodiversity, and climate. I wanted to now invite each of you, if perhaps we only have a few more minutes, and maybe want to have room to leave to any questions that the audience may have. But if you can just maybe share each in a minute or so, what are some of the key recommendations that you are coming with at this COP? And as we're like wrapping up this COP in a couple of days, what is it that you want to see happening at future conversations where critical decisions are being made for the planet and for humanity.
Thanks, Lourdes. Clearly, as you know, you see right across COP and a lot of the different presentations and discussions, and there's been a whole day for recognition of Indigenous peoples, which is great, but we've got to move past the recognition into action, and the actions that deals, particularly like what you're talking about, and Sister from Canada is talking about there, is how do we move into real economic equity, so the money that flows in for the opportunities to be able to go out and do the work that needs to be done out there in order to be able to make changes. In Australia, many of you would be aware that, you know, like the Indigenous people recognition within the Constitution has been rejected through the referendum that was recently held on October 14th in Australia. But regardless of those situations, the imperative is for us to just keep moving. And I stand on the shoulders of amazing people in order to see and know opportunities that are out there. So I think we just got to take the chance, and I do agree that, you know, we've got to be able to create our own opportunities as well through new economies, looking at you know, carbon and biodiversity offsets, and demanding that engagement and Indigenous-led aspects of those things. So it's not time for us to sit idle, and I think you know, we can be still talking about the same things at COP50, and there's a real danger of that. So it's time for action and for us to move on past in just transition, move on past just recognition and great rhetoric words, but let's move into action and recognize, you know, and fund that.
Principalmente incluir a los pueblos originarios en la toma de decisiones globales y regionales, y también al sur global, que de verdad hay una brecha súper grande en donde no se incluye en muchos procesos. Muchos de estos procesos globales tampoco son tan vinculantes en los territorios, y principalmente porque sucede que muchas veces las bases pueden estar alineadas con un gobierno de turno, pero pasa en muchos países que existe, como se llama, el estado profundo. Un estado profundo quiere decir que siempre hay personas dentro del estado que se mueven para la industria, se mueven para grandes intereses. Y ese estado profundo genera mucho daño a pequeñas comunidades, a pequeños territorios, a pueblos indígenas aislados. ¿Por qué? Porque generan muchas barreras. Y muchos de estos funcionarios públicos, personas que están en altos cargos, no tienen competencias interculturales. Y eso es un lenguaje común, o sea, no hay un lenguaje común. Aparte que la ciencia muchas veces tampoco baja el lenguaje de la ciencia, los tecnicismos a los territorios. Hay muchas brechas que hay que ir avanzando para que las cosas también sean vinculantes y para que los países se sientan casi obligados a implementarlas. Estas bajadas de información o esta implementación son muchas veces las grandes brechas. Estos grandes tratados que a veces nos involucran a todos. El de alta mar, por ejemplo, son acciones que nos involucran a todos y nos perjudican a todos. Por mi lado, yo soy migrante climática dentro de mi país y a veces, por más daño que muchas veces dicen que puede causar la naturaleza, el mayor daño lo causan las personas. Las personas que colocan barreras, las personas que no hacen que los recursos lleguen a los territorios. Nosotros podemos decir, porque mi territorio ha sufrido muchas catástrofes naturales, podemos decir, pero ustedes pueden odiar a la naturaleza, irse de ese lugar. No. Cada día que pueden pasar más cosas, más respetamos a la naturaleza. Y eso ha significado que muchos de nosotros nos coloquemos en estas causas. ¿Por qué? Porque queremos que nuestro territorio esté bien y que no sucedan acciones climáticas que quizás muchas veces se pueden detener o se pueden colocar las medidas. Y todas estas decisiones de alta mar o de las pesquerías tienen que ser más estrictas y con una visión de los pueblos originarios. Principalmente un ejemplo, en las pesquerías, los pueblos originarios no cazan, no toman a las hembras. ¿Por qué? Porque reconocen que son reproductivas y hay que dejarlas, volverlas al mar. ¿Qué hacen las grandes pesquerías? Arrasan con todo. O lo mismo, este convenio de alta mar, que incorpore a los pueblos originarios, si se van a cuidar o van a ser parte del 30 por 30, incorporan a los pueblos originarios, se van a ver áreas de conservación internacionales también. O sea, es esa visión, que todas las decisiones globales, regionales, incorporen la visión de los pueblos originarios.
I'm like, what else do I add? I think that some of the key recommendations, obviously we need to be moving beyond the recognition. Yes, we absolutely must be putting Indigenous peoples into decision-making processes. But I think further to that, when we talk about what does it really substantively mean to put Indigenous peoples or move past recognition, is we need to have processes and mechanisms for us to actually substantively participate in these processes, whether that is discussions on how loss and damage is going to be distributed, whether this is on the management of the voluntary carbon reduction process under Article 6, which looks at carbon markets and non-market mechanisms, including things like nature-based solutions, which, while we can have nature-based solutions, how are they going to be capitalized by states, and how are Indigenous protected areas going to be like just utilized without our consent? How do we ensure that our lands and territories aren't at further threat for land grabs, for these carbon markets, for conservation offsets, for these processes? And the only way to prevent continued violation of our rights is to have processes and mechanisms and recognition of Indigenous peoples. So it starts with recognition and moves past recognition into participation, into the processes, and power and decision making. This is what we need to see within this. We need to close that gap for Indigenous participation, and we need to move just beyond this sort of paltry, oh, Indigenous peoples have so much knowledge, and this idea of utilization of us, which is just literally taking. It's appropriating our knowledge, it's appropriating our lands, it's appropriating our ways of being that have modeled low carbon lifestyles to the continuation of colonial power. So what we need to see are processes that actually allow us to hold our rights, decide how they're used, decide how our knowledge is used, and ensure that there is direct access for those trillions of dollars that are going into these markets and in these industries. Right now, there's a ton of investment into science and technology to help solve the climate crisis. And simultaneously, there's all this recognition about the beauty and knowledge and Indigenous ways of being to help get us out of the climate crisis. And no one's done this analysis, and I want to see it. How much money is going towards science and technology, and how much is going to the advancements of Indigenous sciences and technologies? I'm sure that the disparity is worse than the $15 to $1. It's probably $1 billion to $100 for us. And so we need to see real investments in Indigenous peoples. And that comes through the systems like loss and damage and climate finance and adaptation. We need to be demanding for not just recognition and that indigenization of the text. We need to move towards self-determination and sovereignty of Indigenous peoples the world over. Thank you.
Thank you very much. As key recommendations, we know there is no climate action without rights. They should recognize and respect the rights of Indigenous people, and we call on the effective implementation of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. Because we have realized that this declaration has been there for close to 15 years now, but many states, they don't implement this declaration. They don't even consider the declaration. They just move past this declaration. The land rights and community and customary land rights of Indigenous people should be recognized by governments and should be respected. We should also look at mainstreaming Indigenous people, women and gender land rights, because when we are talking about land rights, mostly in Indigenous communities, we see only the men. The women are always forgotten. As my sister said, bringing IPs on decision-making tables is very important. We need to bring them and we need to ensure that they have meaningful participation in these discussions, because without bringing them, making them to have meaningful participation in these discussions and making their decisions count, because at the end of the day, we should not come and then give our opinions and our decisions. At the end of the day, they put them in the background. We need our decisions to count and our voices to be heard. We need direct access to financing, because if you look at indigenous people, as my sister said, there are trillions of dollars coming left and right. All of these $1 trillion, they go left and right and they say money will come to indigenous people. We have promises, we have billions of dollars of pledges that come to us. We are tired of this pledge and whatever. We want to see the money. We want the money to go to the ground, to go to the grassroots level, so that the indigenous people can make use of their money, plan and implement climate action. We know that they have indigenous knowledge that they always use, so we should valorize this knowledge. We should, as we are already exploring into adaptation and mitigation policies, we should make sure that we integrate it in our policy papers, in our national adaptation policies and so on, so that this knowledge can be valorized, and we should also protect the knowledge of indigenous people. Thank you.
Thank you. As we start to close, I just wanted to just put a plug there at 3 p.m. Today is Indigenous Women's Day at the Women and Gender Pavilion. That's building 90, second floor. There's a program happening at the moment, but there's other programming happening throughout the day, including at 3 p.m. There is a panel, as I understand, of Indigenous Women panel happening at 3 p.m. in the Women's and Gender Pavilion. Please join that panel, show support for Indigenous women, for those who are going to be on the panel. And we're speaking both to our brothers who are also in the room to join us in that space. But I don't know if I think we have like a minute or so before the other panel starts, if there's any questions from the audience. No? All right, so thank you very much for joining us. I know it's been a long 2 weeks. I want to especially appreciate each of you for making the time and joining us on a Sunday morning as we are on the second week of COV. Much appreciation. And please join me in applauding for all your contributions.